Welcome to this session, how to present at a virtual conference. So this is aimed at the ECRs at GISRUK. So we want this to be a really useful resource to go through some of the kind of do's and don'ts of presenting online and answer any questions you have. So I'm Nick Bierman, I'm kind of coordinating the session, and I'll say a little bit more about what we're going to do in due course, but I'll hand over to Scott Orford initially to say a little bit about the conference as he's conference chair.
Hi, yes, so I'm organising the conference this year. So the conference is being hosted by Cardiff University. When I agreed, we're hoping it was going to be a face-to-face proper conference, as in being there physically. But no, it's an online conference this year, but it's still going to be as good. We have 69 papers. 3 keynote speakers and over 500 people registered. So it's going to be a big conference despite it being online. And it's great that we have a lot of early career researchers who are giving papers. So the purpose of today is really to give you a bit of background to GISRUK itself. So as you all know, or most of you know if you've read look at the website, there's a COVID-19 theme. And this runs throughout all the papers. So about 1/5 of all the papers have a COVID-related theme. I haven't actually designated any particular session to COVID, so they're all scattered throughout the programme, but I will be flagging them up in the conference proceedings. And then the rest of the papers are more general papers on GIS and GI in general. And a significant number of the papers are by early career researchers, and quite a few of you are here today, which is great. So at the start of the conference on the Tuesday, there's a whole ECR event as well, ECR workshop, and we're going to be emailing you what the themes are and the agenda is for that next week. But for today, it's just an early introduction to GISRUK and a background of how to present online. So I'll pass you over to Nick.
Great, thanks, Scott. That's great. Yeah, so we wanted to run this session a couple of weeks before the main conference, so you actually have a chance to incorporate some of the suggestions and hints and tips into your presentation. So like Scott said, we have a kind of more general early career researchers session on the Tuesday before the main conference, and I'd really recommend everyone come along to that. We'll send out a few more details about that next week, but we're going to do a little bit about how we network at conferences, a little bit about careers, different careers people have had working in GIS, both in academia and outside, and a little bit on research in a very general sense and applying for research funds and publishing and a whole range of aspects. So we'll cover more about that in due course. Today, specifically, we've got 3 different kind of chunks to do. So we're going to look at some kind of key questions for how to do a good presentation. And we're going to do a little bit of a discussion around that. And then we've got some more specific hints and tips for presenting online. So covering a range of stuff in terms of how we do slides, how we actually present, and various other bits and pieces. And then we're actually going to have a go at presenting. So we're going to use the breakout rooms option within Zoom. So split you up into groups of 3. And so everyone in your group can actually have a go at sharing the screen, sharing some slides and talking to them for a minute or so, a couple of minutes. And so you can discuss in your small groups. So we want you to give you an experience of actually doing that. And we're in Zoom because that's what we're using for the main conference session as well. So we wanted to give you some exposure to that. Great. Okay, so I'll hand over to James for the first session, which is a kind of little bit of a discussion about key questions for conference presentations.
Thank you very much, Nick. So I'll first introduce myself. Hopefully, if some of you were at the GISRUK conference last year, you might recognize me. So along with Andrea at Birkbeck, Andrea Ballator, I was organising the conference last year. And one of the things we noticed was that people did a generally really good job of presenting online last year. So well done for that, if that was you. I think we have a few kind of questions that have been asked if this is your first time. And I think there are some nuances about presenting online. We'll cover some of those later that might help you with this. So these are some of the questions that were sent in. So I think we'll start this part of the talk by going through some of these questions. And then if you have other things that you want to add, then please pop them in the chat and we can go on to those. Nick, is Bruce here as well, or am I doing this?
Bruce is not here,
Okay,
but I'm happy to chip in.
I'll crack on. So if any of the other academics or experienced seasoned GISRUK presenter pros want to chip in, then go ahead. But I'll start off by going through some of these questions that we have here. So the first question that people were asking was, how do we structure our presentations, and do we dive straight into the paper? So the way I always think about this is that you want to structure your presentation in a similar way to how you structure your paper. The paper that you were submitting to GISRUK. So if you've written your paper in a fairly clear way, it naturally starts with an introduction to the context. So this is the kind of major problem that you're trying to solve. And this kind of links into the second question here about how do we mention wider debates in our PhD context. It's often a good idea to start with a kind of headline statistic or interesting quote or something that really captures the attention of the audience. Because one of the things to remember is that while you know a lot about your topic, the audience comes from a diverse range of backgrounds. Some are very familiar with GIS, some may be using a bit of GIS within their research. So you need to kind of hook them into the presentation so that they think, that's an interesting question, or I didn't know that about that particular thing. So that's the thing to start with. Start with something that grabs everybody's interest and makes them think, I'm glad I'm in this room, I'm glad I'm watching this presentation. Then you want to really give the reason for what you're doing. So I think this is something that quite often is an issue with people who are new to research, because you perhaps used a really interesting, sophisticated technique that is really exciting, but that doesn't necessarily mean much to other people. So people are generally more interested in the problem you're trying to solve and how it could help, for example, society, rather than learning about that specific technique. So that would come later. So start off with the problem, then define how you're going to solve it. So you might state your research questions and then proceed in the same way that you presented your paper. So you have all of the main results in your paper. You can present those because it's quite a short paper you're typically producing for GISRUK. You can probably get most of the results in your paper in there. Another point to make there is that it is okay if you have some results that you produce since you produced a GISRUK paper to present some of those, as long as they're not kind of revealing any of your unpublished research that you don't want people to see.
One thing I might add, Jones, is, I've often seen it suggested and done very well sometimes that the hook that you get people with at the beginning is actually some of your results. So you don't necessarily start with the kind of setting and that sort of thing, but the hook to get people in is what you might normally do in a results or a conclusion session. So kind of what is the big thing about your paper that makes it really interesting, really amazing? You found whatever it is, and then start off with that.
Yeah.
Different things work for different topics as well. For a lot of these, there's no kind of one right answer, I would say.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think that really thinking about the people who are watching is, with any presentation, whether it's for an academic conference, whether it's to your department or to your university, or maybe if you've got kind of government stakeholders in your project, the audience is always slightly different. So you really need to think about who they are and what's really going to catch their attention. I guess in a GIS conference, we're maybe slightly more technical than maybe a public sector audience, so you can go more into the details, but certainly you want to get that hook first. I guess before we move on, I think the second side of this slide is more is a slightly different topic. So are there any questions on that first part before we move on to the next part? If there are, put them in the chat. Otherwise, we can leave them for the breakout rooms and later on. Okay.
I thought as one thing, it'd be good to include signposting in your slides, because there will if you do a PhD student, your PhD will not fit in a 25-minute talk. You have to pull out the key bits that you want, or even just a case study, and then the key bits. But the question then is, if people want more, where can they go? So can you link to a paper or a write-up or whatever it might be?
Yeah. So you have to have things like the all of the contact details that are necessary for people to follow up, and often people will. So that's one of the difficulties with an online conference, is that you can't then meet with those people who are watching your presentation in the lunch room or at the pub afterwards. So you need to make sure those contact details are easily accessible from your slides, so they can follow up with you. I think that brings us neatly on to the second part, which is what should be in your slides. So I think this probably is a direct quote from somebody's questions, but words, no words, just graphs. What have you found? Bullet points, what you're saying, and how scripted do you advise making the presentation? So I think personally this is quite a personal thing, but I can give advice from my point of view, and then maybe Nick can chip in afterwards. But so a few general tips. Firstly, I wouldn't expect from one of my students to see any words on the slides that you either aren't going to read or don't expect your audience to read. So, for example, I wouldn't expect you to take a paragraph from your GISRUK paper and put it in the slide, then talk about something completely different, or something related that isn't exactly that text. The only time I would ever include a large passage of text if it was a direct quote and I was going to read it out to make a certain point. In general, I would suggest having relatively short bullet points that you can then talk around. So the audience can read those bullet points, or you can read those bullet points out, but everything that's on the slide in terms of text is being either read or explained directly by you. No words. You could have this if you have, for example, a very, very, very descriptive map. You could fill a slide with a map and then go into more detail into exactly what that map is showing. Can you just bear with me 1 second, because the door is knocking and I know the person who is there doesn't have keys. Sorry. The joys of presenting from home. I'll be back in.
No problem, James. So I'll just kind of put in my 2 penneth while he does that. So I think what he made about it being really personal is a good point. You need to find what works for you. I've seen some really, really good presentations with just graphics, no words, no bullet points at all. But that is quite a hard thing to do. I personally like some bullet points to kind of talk around. And I think it's trying different things and find what works for you. And that's something we'll mention later. It's a good idea to practice your presentation. So both in terms of the kind of technical sense of setting up Zoom and sharing screens and all that kind of governance, but also how you actually present it. So I would really, really recommend that you have your 25 minutes or 15 minutes or however long you've got, do your presentation, speak it out loud. Ideally, if you've got someone else in the house you can speak to, great, get them to listen to it. Or if you can't, just do it to your computer or to the wall, and then do that a few times to get that practice, and that will really, really help.
Very sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, so I guess you were just talking about whether or not to have a script for the presentation. Yeah,
I was saying about practicing. So it's really good to practice and find your own style. So I didn't get onto the scripted element. Yeah,
I agree with that, with practicing, because so I guess I've been doing GISRUK presentations and various presentations for about just over 10 years now. And I've never written a script for a presentation. Now, that's not saying that you shouldn't write a script for a presentation, but I think if you practice, as Nick says, if you have a good set of bullet points that are guiding what you're going to say, then each time you practice it, you'll remember what you were talking about for each bullet point. And the thing to focus on is the fact that nobody knows more about your subject than you do. And you want to come across that you know what you're talking about, and you're interested in what you're talking about, and you're really enthusiastic about it as well. And if you use a script, those things may be true, but I feel that it's not quite as easy to come across as really enthusiastic and interested in what you're doing. If you don't have a script, it's also impossible to make mistakes on your script. Obviously, you can kind of freeze and forget what you're going to say, but I don't think that's really a problem. If you'll get through those situations. If it's your first time presenting, you may find yourself feeling a bit flustered. But if you take a sip of water, just have a deep breath, just say, sorry, just give me a second, and then start talking again, you'll usually find you can get through those things. I guess that's another point about nerves. I mean, I think everybody to some extent will get nervous before presentations, whether it's their first ever presentation or whether they've given 100 presentations. May depend on what audience you're speaking to, may depend on lots of factors, but being nervous, I think, is a good thing because it shows that you care about doing well. You want to do a good job and give a good presentation. If you're not nervous at all, if you're completely confident, then that can sometimes be a sign that you haven't really prepared as well as you could have. I don't know what you think about that, Nick.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I think, our primary job is not giving presentations. We're researchers, we do research. So, no one is expecting a TV presenter level of presentation from our presentations, and if you can get the enthusiasm you have for your subject or topic across, that the audience will see that as well. And when you're doing the practice, if you can get someone to watch, you get some feedback from them. What came across well, what didn't. And I know one thing that I do, and I still struggle with, even after having done presentations for several years, is I tend to go too fast. So there's always time to take a breath and take a sip of water and continue. And when you're actually presenting it, it seems like hours were passing, but actually it's like a second or two. So if you tend to rush, try and relax and try and take your time. There's plenty of time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Definitely. You can practice a presentation 10 times and it will be 25 minutes each time. And then you can turn up and rush through it in 10, 15 minutes. That happens all the time. And that just means there's more time for questions, which can be a good or a bad thing, depending on how confident you are with what you're presenting. But I'm sure you guys are all really confident in your research, so that shouldn't be a problem.
And on the note of questions, questions are a great opportunity for you to expand on what you said in the presentation. And people at GISRUK, they know we have a lot of VCR, so the questions will be nice and people will be nice to you. So don't be scared of the audience.
I do have one more point to make on the question of whether we should include wider debates. I think the first time you ever attend a conference or do a presentation, you do get a bit of imposter syndrome in your field and you want to cling onto existing literature. So you're kind of tempted to put in 2 or 3 slides and talk about what already is out there, what other people have done. But you just have to remember, like, your paper is good enough to be accepted. You have done enough work or got enough findings to include that as the bulk, or it depends on your research. So you need to remember, like, you are good enough to be accepted and you're within this community now. So don't go on like 70% of your talking about what everyone else has already done. So that's like another important note to make.
Yeah, I'm conscious that we're not getting many questions, so we can just wait for a while until somebody asks something. I guess.
Sorry, James. Just to confirm that there's long and short papers, and some of you might be doing long papers, some of you are doing short papers. So again, I emailed this round a while ago. I'm going to email it next week when you get your how to join instructions, which I'm still finalising. So if it's a short paper, it's 10 minutes for the presentation and 5 minutes for questions and answers. So there's 15 minutes overall, and 10 minutes will go very quickly. So really focus on your results at this point, or your methodological innovation, depending on what actually you've done. And for the long paper, it's 20 minutes presentation, and 5 minutes questions and answers. So you've got slightly longer in terms of what you have to produce. And the short papers are, I think we allocated them because they looked more like they were a short paper, they're maybe more technical, as opposed to results, or they looked like there was early results, so there wasn't very much results, but it was still very interesting. So so just bear in mind whether you're a longer or short paper, and it's 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and you will be cut off because we're very tight for time. So after 10 minutes or 20 minutes, you'll be silenced, and we can silence you now online easier than we can in person. But part of the trick is to the chair will actually help you, because when you're presenting, you can get very involved in the presentation and you forget to look at the time. So the chair will be there, and 2 or 3 minutes before the end, they will tell you you've got 2 or 3 minutes left, and it's okay to skip. If you're not quite, you think, oh, I'm running out of time, you can skip over a couple of slides which aren't the key. So you can jump ahead if you can say, oh, I'm running out of time, I'm just going to go to this bit here. That's fine. Because don't forget, your paper will be online, and it will be accessible to everyone for the conference. So next week, at the end of next week, the conference proceedings will be online with links to all your papers. So delegates will be able to read your paper before you do the presentation as well. So just be aware that the chair will be timing you and will cut you off.
Thanks, Scott. Before I pass back to Nick, I just wanted to say one last thing, which is that the GISRUK community is well known for being very friendly and supportive of early career researchers. So unlike some other places, you won't be getting people asking very, very harsh and intrusive questions if they know you're an ECR. That's not what we're about. So try not to worry too much about that kind of aspect of things. Okay, so I'll pass back over to Nick.
Cool, thanks, James. So we'll go on to the next chunk. So some hints and tips, and Abby is leading on this. Sorry, I just spotted a question in the chat. Louise asked, should we introduce ourselves as ECRs in that regard? And I would say yes, definitely, at the beginning. So explicitly say you're an ECR, and then say you're a first, second, third year PhD student, master student, postdoc, whatever position you are in. So do include that in your introduction.
So what will happen is 5 to 10 minutes before the present. So if you look at the program, there's a 1/4 hour break between sessions. And so the joining instructor will tell you to actually go to your room 10 to 15 minutes before the start. And then you will meet the chair, the other people given the papers, and the moderator, and all the delegates will be in a waiting room. So you have what's called a practice session in Zoom, but it means that you can have a conversation with the chair and the other three or four paper presenters without the delegates listening to you, and you can tell the chair then when they introduce you that you're an early career researcher. So the chair will go, next up is this person, and they're an early career researcher from this. So the chair will ask you as part of the sort of practice session just before the session starts properly. But yes, definitely introduce yourself as an early career person. Hi, Caitlin. Yes, again, this will go out in the bump about what's happening. So yes, we will be live tweeting on our Twitter accounts, and if you want to tweet as well, you can. And we might be taking screenshots. So there is a thing about consent to screenshots as well, and we're also recording as well. So all the sessions were recorded, and then you can opt out afterwards. So they won't be going online straight away because we're going to edit them down. And if you don't want your presentation to be part of the GISRUK YouTube, we'll edit it out. Okay, so you'll be recorded, but you'll have the choice not if you're not happy with it, oh, you don't think you're happy with your presentation, we will edit you out, so don't worry about that. The timeline today, well, I'm not going to look at them, Charlie, till tomorrow. So as long as it's 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to start downloading them because we need to get them online. So yeah, anytime today.
So my name's Abigail and I'm part of the GISRUK committee, but I'm also a PhD student. And last year I presented at my first conference and it was GISRUK. So I basically have made all the mistakes possible for you so you don't have to. So I'm gonna give you some of my own personal hints and tips and some of the other members of the committees. So first off, you might want to think about what's going to be happening in your house or your room on that day. Are there going to be other people floating about in the house? You might want to think about things such as earphones with a microphone, or putting one section like I have here. Rest of my room is a complete mess, but it looks quite like a nice little academic background there. Or if you've got other people in the house or you don't have a good space, think about maybe putting your institute backdrop on the screen or blurring the background of the screen. Again, just to reiterate, practicing, whether that's people outside of the discipline, practicing to a time, because you'll have someone chairing your session like me and we will just have to cut you off and you might then get a billion questions, tough questions on your methods, for example. So one suggestion as well is to think about practicing sharing your PowerPoint rather than your whole desktop screen. Once I was in a meeting and I was getting loads of Facebook notifications from my mum tagging me in pictures of cats, and it's just annoying, it's just a bit distracting. Yep, so that's one good idea. And again, like, present to someone out the field, because even within the GIS community, you might be using complicated methods that other people don't understand, and they might find this really interesting, and you're in quite a short time space, so you want to get as much as possible about your research across as possible. So you might want to try a technique that I use to try and look in the camera rather than at yourself. I've put a little red dot next to my camera to naturally try and draw my eyes to the camera, as it's quite easy to wander off sometimes. It just makes you more connected within the digital realm. I think we're used to presenting in big conferences where you try and give at least 20% of your eye contact to each member of the audience, but it's different this time. You might also want to try and cover yourself up so you don't have to look at yourself the whole time, as it's been found that you get way more exhausted, you're probably over analysing what you're doing, and especially if you're doing a long paper as well, 20 minutes of talking and looking at yourself and judging what you're doing, you'll be very tired by the end of it. In terms of note taking, one little tip that I would give is make your notes more dense in areas that you think you might stumble. Even if you're like not going to read directly off them, it's kind of like a safety blanket. When you get to a bit where you're a bit worried about and then you see all your notes are there, you think, okay, if I screw up and say everything wrong, it's there waiting for me. Also, especially in the methods section, especially for me, I stumble on really big words all the time. And it's a good idea to maybe write them out phonetically. That's what I do, or put them in font 16. So if you're all panicky and flustered, you can just see this one big long methods word and just read it off, basically. In terms of the chat, there might be lots of people engaging, which is really great, giving you nice little comments, but it can be quite distracting. So try and focus on your presentation, and we can answer the questions at the end. The chair will help you do that. In terms of the slides, We used to have it on lovely big projections, but not everyone at home might have a big screen on their laptop. They might be looking at it on a tablet, for example. So you want everything to be easily readable, especially in terms of graphs and figures. Some of the most interesting parts of research is looking at what's on the axes, so we want to be able to see them all. I think one of my favourite tips, or the biggest thing I learned last year, is after 20 minutes of speaking, you can be really exhausted and you're so pleased with yourself that you've done and completed it and didn't fluff it or did fluff it, that when it comes to the questions, you're just slightly out of it, basically. You're a bit exhausted. Someone asks you a question and it just goes straight over your head. And the natural thing to do is to just ramble aimlessly about your research, like I did last year, and just hope that they don't ask for clarification and just be quiet, basically. But you can ask again. They know you're tired. Even if you ask twice, for them to rephrase the question, because if they're asking a question, they're genuinely interested in your research. So it's better to take time, get clarity, and answer the question properly. What else am I talking? Yeah, thinking about how, especially if some of you guys are making maps. I know this year we're presenting lots of maps, and you want to point to specific towns, for example, in mine. You might want to think about how we're going to point these out, whether that's using a virtual laser or just going over or noting down some really detailed descriptions, so the top left, for example. So even though there are perhaps a lot more things to think about during presenting online, and they can be a bit of a pain, there are lots of benefits. So maybe 5 minutes before your presentation and you're a bit like, oh, I don't want to be doing this, it's annoying, I'd rather be at an in-person conference. We can think about that it's good practice for future careers, job interviews online, for example, or if some of you want to go into teaching, I reckon we'll have lots of online teaching still. It's also really good because this year we've expanded a lot more. Lots more people internationally can come to the conference and see all your amazing research. They might not have been able to get the travel money, for example. So there are lots of benefits, and maybe you should think about these little points before you present and think what an amazing thing you're part of this year. Right, now we're going to go on to a few ideas on how to set up your screen, and we've got a few pictures of what Nick does and what I do to give you some variation in ideas. So I'll pass over to Nick.
Great, thanks, Abby. Yeah, so I just wanted to share a little bit about how I've actually got stuff arranged on my desk, and it's worth thinking about what you can do. I'm happy to share what I do, but that won't work for everyone. So we'll hear a bit from Abby as well. And if anybody else has got any questions or things they want to chip in, please do. So one of the first things is where is the camera? And I've got a separate camera that sits on top of my monitor here. And I try and look at the camera when I'm presenting, or at least look at the camera some of the time. And I really like Abby's idea of the red sticker to go on that to remind me to do that. So that's something I probably will do. One other really useful tool is the presenter view on PowerPoint. So if you are doing PowerPoint slides, when you actually launch the presentation, if you have a separate monitor, or even if you don't, you can get up this screen. And so what this does is it will show you what the current slide is, and whatever's on there, but it will also show you what the next slide is, which is really useful. So you know what's coming next, but also there's this notes view as well. So if you want to write yourself notes, like the phonetic spelling of a long word that you can't pronounce, or a definition, or whatever you want, you can write in the notes page, and that's really useful. It can mean you look as though you can actually know and remember all the stuff, where in fact it's actually just written in front of you and you can just refer to that. So that's a really useful tool. probably noticed on the photo that I'm actually running on the laptop and I've got an external monitor. And so that is really useful because it allows us to arrange the windows slightly more sensibly. So we can have the slides and people's video up at the same time. So we can see that. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but with whatever you've got, you can try different arrangements to see what works for you. The kind of typical example I do is I try and keep everything on the main monitor because that's where the camera is and that's where I'm supposed to be looking. But I will typically have the presenter PowerPoint view here and then the video. You know, normally this would be everybody else's video, not me. And this is how I've got it up at the moment. And then I've actually got the chat as well, so I can see if a question comes in. Maybe that you don't need that. But one other thing you can do is when you set up PowerPoint, you can either share a second screen or you can share a section of this screen. So you see there's a little green border there, that's Zoom. And so when you share in Zoom, you can share a section of the screen. It's under the advanced options, but that allows me to share this slide. But then I can also move my mouse pointer around on here and point out different bits on the slide. So there's a few different ways of doing it. It's well worth spending a bit of time experimenting with it. And this is Abby's setup. So do you want to say a little bit about that, Abby?
Yeah, I'm a lot more old-fashioned and a bit of technophobe. So initially, when I was practicing last year, I had 6 different pieces of paper underneath my screen, and I did a test run with a friend over Zoom, and then they were like, Abby, I couldn't hear anything you were saying because the whole time the paper was rustling. So I wouldn't recommend that at all. Maybe just one A4 paper if that you find it easier to read notes like that. But yeah, I would not recommend doing prompt cards because it's so rustly. But I do use my iPad. Not everyone has one, but I find or something to cover up the video of me as well. And thinking about lighting as well, I do have a Zoom light, but sometimes a lamp either side works really well, just so people can see you and you're not a little figure lurking in the corner, I guess.
And you can turn off your own video in Zoom as well. So you do have the option of that. If you go to the video panel and then click the 3 dots, you can choose hide self view, which will turn off the video for you so you can't see it. So if you do want to do that, that can be really, really useful. Great. Okay, so I think that's good. I think we'll go straight into the next section now. Just keeping aware of time. We want to be done by 3, ideally. So we're now going to have a go with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up breakout rooms. So there should be 3 people in each room. And what we want you to do is to spend a little bit of time sharing screens. So try and share a screen. If you've got a slide you put together, to share that and spend a few seconds talking through that. And then everybody has a go at that. So with the 3 of you, and then get some feedback as well. You know, did this come across okay? Did it not? How did the screen sharing going? So we're slightly behind on time. So we'll probably do 12 minutes on this, something like that. So we have a little bit of time for wrap up at the very end. I'll set up the breakout rooms. Zoom in its infinite wisdom is going to stick me, Abby and Scott in the room and James as well. So we'll try and get you in groups of 3 and then us 4 will come around and see how people are getting on.
Apparently people can't share their screens.
Yeah, no, someone just said that. I'm not sure quite what we're going to be able to do about that.
Excuse me, I need help because the host disabled people to share the screen. Can you open this function?
Can you share now? I've changed the settings bin, so can you share it now?
Let me see. Yeah, I can do it. Yeah, it can be true.
Cool.
Okay, great.
I'll send a message out.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So everyone's back from the breakout rooms now. So I hope that was useful. I hope that was a helpful experience. We'll happily have questions now if people have got questions. So please do pop them in the chat. I did know that Caitlin asked about, will the papers be live tweeted during the conference? So Scott, I don't know if you want to answer that.
Yes, hopefully we will be live tweeting. We'll come up. I think there's already a hashtag actually, which I think it's GISRUK 2021, which we're using on our Twitter account. But that will be publicised as well. So feel free to tweet. As I said, that we might be capturing the screens as well, so that there is a consent about capturing screens in the same way there's a consent about recording. So we'll be tweeting. We always do.
Yeah. I would say if you are on Twitter, do use the hashtag and feel free to promote your own paper as well. Say, I'm going to be presenting on whatever it is at whatever time. Come along and do some self-promotion as well. It's always a good opportunity.
Could I ask a question on that same note? So what's the policy around sharing the links to the presentations? Because obviously you can tweet that a presentation is happening, but you don't necessarily want to post the Zoom link on Twitter. No,
so there'll be something going around next week about etiquette to everybody, and it's not share the links to the sessions. You have to register to get those. I mean, I don't mind. Just say you had a colleague somewhere in Natural England or somewhere where they'd be really interested in a paper, then it's okay to email that person the sort of the link and when it is. Don't put it on social media and don't tweet the links. Partly because we don't want trolls, and partly because we have a limit of the number of people we can have on Zoom in any particular session, and we don't want to we won't crash it. It just means that people will be able to get in after so many people. So we don't want to be too popular. So it's okay to share it with a colleague, but don't publicize it on social media or anywhere like that.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for taking part. And I dropped in on a few breakout sessions. They seem to be going quite well. Apologies for the slight mix-up at the very beginning, because I didn't check the box to allow you all to share screens. So apologies for that. And it's a great example of why practice is important. So hopefully we'll be right, and we'll have a practice session before the day itself. Any questions, please do feel free to ask. Otherwise, we will look forward to seeing you at the ECR event on the Tuesday.
Yeah. So just check the website. I'll be updating the website with the agenda for the ECR event, and we'll email you the links through Eventbrite as usual.